Sun's out, fun's out, and it's time for sleeveless garments. So if you've always wanted to know how to do one of these one-piece facings where your armhole and your neck are completely finished and your garment has an opening, like a dress or a shirt, you can do one of these one-piece facings and you're gonna really love the finish. Let's do it. All right, your one-piece facing will look something like this. Either if you have a front opening or a back opening, the steps are going to be the same. You're going to have one that has the placket built in here. This is my front. The back will look a little bit like this, with the armhole and the back neck facing built in. And if your back looks like this, that's fine too. So if you have a front opening or a back opening, this method's going to work. You don't need to finish your pieces around this perimeter edge. We're going to do that at the very end so it looks nice and clean. But there is one little step I highly recommend that you do, and that is to trim down the seam allowance around the neck and the armhole and the placket down to 1/4 inch or 6.3 millimeters. And that goes for the armholes, the neck, and this placket. The same goes for your garment. You're going to want to trim down your placket, your neck, and your armholes, the seam allowance, down to 1/4 inch or 6.3 millimeters, and you're going to get a really nice finish if you do this. Your shirt or bodice should be prepped with the shoulders sewn, and if you have darts or chest pockets, if you're doing a shirt or a dress, it doesn't matter, you want to have those all done too, so it'll be a little bit easier in the end. So get your shoulders, and I would recommend just pressing the seam open. You don't need to finish that edge because it's going to be enclosed, but if you like to press the seam one direction, or maybe you overlock them together, press them toward the back. And for the facings, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to sew the shoulders together just like this. We don't need to finish those edges there. You're going to sew your regular seam allowance. And when you press this seam, either press it open if you pressed your shirt or bodice open. If you press the bodice shoulder seams one direction, press the facing the opposite direction so we can offset those thicknesses right there at the shoulder. All right, let's get sewing. I'm using a smaller seam allowance on my shoulders only because of the scale of this sample, since it's a half size and 1/4 inch is half of my seam allowance. So that's the only reason I'm doing that. I don't have any changes that you need to make for your shoulder seam allowances unless you want to. All right, it's time for our first sewing step. So we're going to use that small seam allowance and we're going to sew around the armhole, around the placket and neck, and the other armhole. So it looks just like this. Whether you have a front opening or back opening, it doesn't matter as long as you don't attach it here or attach the side seams. It's going to work. All right, there we go. Now, sometimes people draft this facing to be a little bit smaller than what it's sewing to, just kind of like an undercollar where they shave off a little bit here and there, and that's fine. Just line up your edges and sew it. Make sure you offset your thicknesses at your shoulders or press the seam open. All right, so now our next step is we're going to clip and we're going to iron. So remember, the more clips you get, the better curve you get. So we're going to clip all these curves. We're going to trim around this corner here at your top of your placket. All right, so now if you didn't use the narrower seam allowance, I want you to trim your edges down to that 1/4 inch now that you've got it all clipped. You could do it before you clip it as well. Okay, so the next step is we're going to turn this right side out and then we're going to press it. So you're just going to do this from the piece that doesn't have the opening, so the side that doesn't have the opening. So I'm going to do this from the back because that's my front and it has the placket there. And we're just going to pull that front through to the back here. My opening is going to be pretty small, and sometimes these can be pretty small, so you just need to kind of fiddle with it. I'm going to use a loop turner to help mine. Okay, that's sometimes the hardest part, especially mine is so tiny, or if you have really small straps, and that's why you also want to trim down that seam allowance. All right, so now let's go to the iron. Okay, so I'm gonna press this really good. I'm also gonna kind of lift it up here and just press the seam one direction as far as I can. It'll help get a nice crisp edge. Even at the neckline here, you can't really see it, but right here along this neck, I'm kind of just pushing, trying to iron a little bit of that seam. And we're just gonna go around and do this all the way around as many edges as possible. And then we're gonna focus on the edge, the finished edge. Now I'm gonna iron the finished edge here, and I do it from the facing side so I can see a little bit of the garment on this side. I try and get it to pull to the inside a little bit. Make sure you roll this edge, get it all turned right side out. And now if you want to do any understitching, I would do so on your neck now before we do the last step to close the side seam. And then you can do your armhole understitch after we close the side seam. So my little piece is pretty small, so it's going to be hard for me to get in there, but you might be able to get a little bit of your neckline, go as far up as possible, and then just do a little bit here and here. But most likely if you've pressed this, and your facing is a little bit smaller, it's going to pull the outside to the inside and you're not going to have to worry about it. Okay, so now let's do our last step. So we're going to line up our side seam here, and if it helps you, what I like to do is offset these thicknesses. So I'm going to press this seam allowance down and this one up. It doesn't matter which. And then now I can kind of lock these seam allowances right up against each other, and they're more likely to line up. And personally, I would go for the seam lining up rather than the edge here or here, because when we turn this, you want it to have a nice smooth transition. All right, so now we're going to sew this at our regular seam allowance. And you go all the way down the side seam, just like this. And we'll do the other one. All right, so now let's go and press the seam. Now, if you plan on overlocking this or finishing this edge, you probably don't want to press this open like I'm about to. Or maybe you pre-overlocked your side seams and now you're just going to press them open. All right, and now we're going to poke that facing to the inside. And make sure you mash this seam down when you fold it over it, just like that, so that you get it all the way to the inside and it's nice and flat. Because if you just fold it over, sometimes it's a little bumpy, so you kind of got to tell it what you want it to do. All right, and then we'll try and get this armhole, the strap up here out of the way like this. And I try and press it in that curved position. And same with this one over here. Get this all situated. Pull the strap up there so I can get to it. So our last step is to finish the edge of our facing here, and you can hem it, you can bind it, Hong Kong finish, or overlock it. No matter what you do, you can just do a nice continuous edge all the way around. And then if you want, you can add your label right there at the end. So I'm going to overlock mine and I'll be right back. All right, so let's check it out here. So when you're putting something like this with all these curves through your serger, here's just a little side tip. Make sure that when you're going through your machine like this, and say we're sewing along our machine, right here it's going to get kind of dicey. Your shirt, look at that, it's already creeping under there. So make sure you pull the shirt completely out and you just focus on that inch that's right in front of you. Get this nice and pulled out as you push it through the machine, just like that. The other things you can do, like binding or the finish, or just even just turning under the edge once and top stitching it, that's completely sufficient as well. Okay, so if we wanted to add a label, I would do so like this. I would stick it right under whatever your finished edge is, and I would stitch across the top there, just like this. I would back tack as well. And then the very last thing you want to do is secure your armhole facings here from flipping out to the right side. And how I would do that is stitching in the ditch. Now there's another way you can do this, and that is to make sure that you get this turned to the inside like this. Lift this up here and then grab a little bit of your seam allowance right here, and you can stitch the facing to the seam allowance. It's a little tight in there, but you can see that you can hold that really firmly, make sure nothing shifts. I'm going to use my awl to secure it. And then just put a little tack right there. Okay, and just like that, let's get rid of this thread here. And on the right side, you can't see any of that tacking. So if you want to do stitch in the ditch, make sure again that your facing is to the inside, exactly how you want it. And if you want, you can pin kind of away from the edge here, like that, away from this seam here. And now we're going to pull the seam apart like this and stitch right there in the ditch to catch the facing. So you can feel your facing in there and just stitch right there. Put your needle down into that little ditch of your seam. Clip your threads, clip them on the inside as well. And that also secures your facing to the inside, just like that. And if your thread is matching, you really won't see it. All right, well, good job sewing your one-piece facing, and I hope to see you out there in the sun enjoying all of your sleeveless garments.